And privilege is a concept that makes people really, really squeamish. And I
Yeah.
get it. It's uncomfortable if you have it to talk about it. But it basically says that in a world that has inequity, in a world that is focused on competition and power up, power over, that there's going to be inequities. And that means that someone is going to be on the top, and those people have privilege. So the more privilege you have, the better off you likely will be, or the less barriers you will have within society. Now, if you're doing Enneagram work and you don't think that that's going to be impacted by your privilege, then it's likely that there's some form of spiritual bypass that's happening. Because even when I first was learning about the Enneagram and I read about the levels of development, I was like, some of the unhealth or the average, quote, average aspects of the type 8, I'm like, only wealthy white dudes can do that. And it still be considered average. If I did that, I'd be fired, I'd be kicked out, I'd be branded some, ungodly name. Like, if I did that, it would be so out of the bounds of what's appropriate. So I'm like, all right, so this is the levels, quote, the levels of development for people who have privilege and are able to, have access to the Enneagram. But what about the rest of us?
Yeah.
What about the rest of us? Like being dominating or taking things over. I'm like, that's a healthy expression of a type 8.
Yeah.
But it is if you consider, what the dominant idea of what power is, which is power over, that's dominating, that's coercive. And white men who have that kind of power are seen as leaders.
Right. Natural leaders.
Right. Natural born, whereas the same, women or, non-men in general are seen as troublemakers. They're too bossy. They need to know their role. They're a bitch. Sorry if you have to bleep that out. Um, but that's like, so if we're looking at our Enneagram work, it's going to be impacted by our identity. And our identity is always impacted by societal norms at the time. Something that may be a privilege now might not have been seen or even thought of as a privilege 20 or 25 years ago. And so if it's important for us to have that as a way of processing through what are our next steps in our work.
So good.
So I'll pick again on the Enneagram 8. So as a Black woman, my voice, especially when I've had male supervisors, for example, has not been heard. It has not been listened to. I have been called angry when I'm not. I've been called angry when I'm passionate. I have been, chastised and sent to um, seminars on how to communicate effectively. And so my work isn't necessarily going to be to not take up space. Whereas, maybe a white male's work as an 8 is actually to not take up as much space, to actually work on those energetic boundaries and how much space are you taking up? Because if you already have privilege, you are naturally taking up more space. But then you also are an 8, which means that your energy is taking up a lot of space. So your work as a white male 8 might actually be to pull in your energy and to wield it with much more precision. And mine as a Black woman might actually be to expand my energy if it's safe. But I have to actually look at, like, what is that level of safety for me? White men have to look at what is the level of safety for them, because for white men, it doesn't feel safe to feel like if I pull back, I'm going to lose privilege. I'm going to lose power. And most that I know aren't really down for that. They're not interested in that experience. But when you recognize that privilege is about inequity within society, maybe it makes it a little bit easier for you to be like, all right, if I take a step back and that creates space for another person, then that's wonderful. Because I don't have to be in this scarcity mindset. When I can see that maybe there's plenty for all of us, then I can move and flow within and not have to just be like one expression of myself all the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that we're having this conversation because we do have this tendency. I guess it's just our brain wants to make things easy and like the least amount of thinking and like, let's get there the quickest. And it's like, okay, what does growth look like? And we have like those are growth arrows. But again, it's just like adding that additional layer. So I love that I always say I like to leave actually with more questions. Like I'm not here to give people answers, but leave with more questions. And I think that's another one of those considerations or questions to ask ourselves, not just our type, but like you're saying, gender, culture, race, upbringing, all these things go into it. And it's not just a simple, here's your 5 growth steps.
Right.
Go ahead.
If only.
Right. I know that you have with the work that you do, you kind of have this 3-pronged approach: Enneagram, anti-racism, and then embodiment.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe this is the 7 in me coming out but I hear this like embodiment and I'm like, yeah, like embodiment. Okay. Yeah, yep. But like, what does that actually mean? Like, what are we doing when we hear embodiment?
I think of embodiment in a multifaceted kind of way. One part of our embodiment is actually like what's my body doing? Like the color of my skin, the color of my eyes, the texture of my hair, how that's perceived. Do I really understand that? Do I, if I have a chronic illness, how is that impacting things? So like looking at and being with our body, that's one aspect of what embodiment is. Because, in a space with, even if there's like a very mixed group of people, someone who has a white body is always going to be held as the leader or the authority, just because of centuries of conditioning, centuries of socialization into that. Even if none of us agree with that, even if we're doing a shared governance model, if that is not being thought of intentionally, a lot's going to be missing. Another aspect of our embodiment is our nervous system. I'd like to think of the nervous system as an entity or a being that we get to be related to, because our nervous system is always trying to make sure that we avoid things that are going to harm us and that we find safety. But our nervous system doesn't have time context and it doesn't have situational context. So as adults, as fully grown people, we get to say, oh, nervous system, you're reacting because you're conflating being uncomfortable with being unsafe. You actually are safe. And so it's then being able to have that and being able to go and say, oh, okay, well, let me regulate my nervous system, because my nervous system thinks that something is not safe. And my nervous system is wrong. My nervous system is misinterpreting what's happening right now because of conditioning, because of socialization. And so it's okay. There's nothing wrong with you or with your nervous system if that's true. We as adults get to provide context. So a lot of, and then another aspect of embodiment is embodiment practices, movement practices to come back to ourselves, like breathing or dancing, or, it's really like all of those things kind of together that allow us to have that kind of relationship with our bodies so that we can actually like be present and do the work